Hello, everyone. This is Mason Richey here from Hankook University of Foreign Studies and the Asia Society. And we're happy to have you here joining us again for another of our Asia Society Korea Roundtables. Usually, for those of you who've seen these before, we address issues that involve international affairs in a very direct sense, frequently security-related issues. And this time we're doing something a little bit outside of the norm. We're going to be discussing an issue which is not specifically related to the Korean Peninsula. In fact, we'll be talking quite a bit more about the US today. But I think you'll see as we cover the topic of racism in the US that in fact it does impact international affairs, and it does impact also the role that the United States plays abroad, including here on the Korean Peninsula. So with that background, I'm going to move directly into a brief introduction of our four outstanding guests today, and then we'll go ahead and get started with today's discussion. So starting right away, I want to begin with Mitchell Moss, who has been kind enough to join us from the U.S. Embassy. Mr. Moss is Minister Counselor for Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy at the Embassy and has been here for a number of years. And if I understand correctly, I think we'll be soon moving on to newer pastures in the relatively near future. So we wish him good luck as he moves forward. Secondly, we have Angela Naimou, an Associate Professor of Literature at Clemson University, whose book, Salvage Work, won the ASAP Prize for Best Book in 2015. And a lot of her work deals with the intersection of race and literature and empire and politics and the imaginary of racism, if you will. We have also General Vincent Brooks, who retired in 2019 as a four-star general in the U.S. Army, and his last post was as the four-star general heading the United States Forces Korea, as well as the United Nations Command here on Korean Peninsula. He is, if I remember correctly, the first African-American ever to be I believe they call it cadet captain or first captain at the United States Military Academy in West Point, and only the 8th African-American in the history of the United States to become a four-star general. He also happens to be a tremendous speaker. He is currently in his quote-unquote retirement, doing many things, including working both as a research fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center and at the Clements Center and Strauss Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And lastly, we have journalist Nemo Kim, who is, in addition to being a journalist with The Guardian and other media outlets in Korea, also a lecturer in Korea on journalism and other topics, and also a film critic. So we have an interesting mix of people, a bit more eclectic than usual. As most of you have noted, probably who have seen these before, I tend to have on academics and practitioners in politics. This time, since I thought that we were dealing with a topic that was in some sense very diverse in the range of issues that can be discussed about it, I thought it might be good to have a wider set of viewpoints. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And as I mentioned to each of you, I think what I would like to do is something a bit different. Instead of immediately starting off with a sort of dialogue or roundtable format, I'd like to get a small statement, I guess, from each of you, maybe taking two to 3 minutes to answer the question of how some aspect of your experience, educational, professional, personal, has been impacted by racism in the US, in Korea, or elsewhere. And let's start with Mr. Moss.
Thank you, Mason. No one likes to consider themselves a racist, but I think we all have work to do in our own individual lives to become more aware of that part of American history and American culture. So I'd just like to begin in talking about my own history. Both of my parents were from small towns around Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Their parents were small farmers. My grandfather, my mother's father, benefited in the 1930s from the Works Progress Administration, went to Bogalusa, Louisiana, and supported his family in the Citizens Conservation Corps camp there. Had he been black, he would not have been able to do that. My father was the first person with a college education in his family. He went to the University of Southern Mississippi in the early 50s, which was not integrated. Had he been black, he would not have been able to do that. Because he did that, he got a job with General Electric. He was a computer scientist. I wound up being born in Huntsville, Alabama, because he was working on the Redstone Arsenal in NASA's Rocket Propulsion Division. Had I been born to a black family, they likely would not have been landowners. They likely would not have been able to go to college. In 1962, as an African-American child in Hattiesburg, I would not have had access to the education that I got. I was able to go to an excellent high school, private high school, and got an education at a great Jesuit university in New Orleans. And looking back now, I have to acknowledge that everything culturally that would have disadvantaged me had I been born to an African-American family in that place and time, actually advantaged me as a child of a white family. Would I have said that 30 years ago? I don't think so. I think I'm more aware now of the benefits that I had. And they included being able to make the same stupid mistakes most young men make without them being fatal, either life-threatening because of encounters with police or fatal to my prospects professionally. I'm more aware of that now than I've ever been. And I think that's work that I've had to do. And it's especially important to me to acknowledge that the same grandfather who benefited from the WPA program was a Klan member and was very likely involved in a lynching in the 1960s that my grandmother told me about on her deathbed. So it means a lot to me to be able to be here. And I think it's important to tie this conversation back to our own lives and our own history. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's great. I know, by the way, my grandparents were also from Huntsville, Alabama, and my grandfather was also in the Civilian Conservation Corps. So there's at least a bit of a historical parallel between the both of us. Angela.
Thank you to Mason. I'm so glad to be in conversation with everyone. Maybe there's continuity here. I can begin just by talking a bit about where I'm from and where I live now, because those two places have taught me a lot about racism and the public imagination. One is the industrial north. So the first place is where I grew up, in an Iraqi minority community just outside of Detroit, Michigan, a city that from very early on, the earliest decades of the 20th century, was already organized in entrenched ways by racial segregation in nearly every aspect of daily life, and was notoriously Black residents. And it was violence, as you probably know, that was the immediate spark for the city's uprising of 1967, which is also known as the Detroit riots. And the city was left further devastated. The deindustrialization was beginning in the 1940s and 50s. By then, Black residents were widely blamed, and that continues even into recent years until now. That blame is taken for granted by a lot of white Michiganders. And in that context, I wondered, what did it mean for my mother to have arrived in 1969 Detroit, seeing only the ruin, but insensible to the history of racism that had made the city and had constrained the lives of so many residents. Where I lived, my immigrant community imagined itself to be white. The white residents imagined people like me to be Italian, if they were being polite, or else they would call us dirty Arabs, which is something that I was about 8 years old, and an artist whose booth I loved at an elementary fair ended up turning around and shouting at me, "Dirty Arab, get out of here." And I thought, wow, this is my first encounter with art and the racist imagination in a way I didn't expect. The second place that I wanted to talk about is where I live now. just 2 miles from Clemson University in the state of South Carolina. It's a campus that was built through the use of convict lease laborers after the violent end of Reconstruction. One of the architects of that white supremacist takeover was Benjamin Tillman, who is also an original member of Clemson's Board of Trustees and was pretty important to US political history. The land sits on what was once John C. Calhoun's former plantation. Before that, it was Cherokee lands lost in treaties after wars. And that land itself became a gift from Calhoun's son-in-law to the state of South Carolina. And Clemson University, like nearly every university in the United States, has barely begun to reckon with the racist exploitation that garnered the labor and the resources for its site of research and teaching. And so racism revealed itself as a set of imaginative acts that have gained institutional traction. And I think about how it's everywhere in the common sense ideas that people have, but also in institutional decisions where narratives and ideas, come together to form knowledge, policy, procedure, and practice. And those acts can have such devastating consequences, in part because they've gained the status of knowledge. It's in many ways a counter to what Rich had so beautifully done in his own imaginative act of imagining a family otherwise than what he had. I'm thinking a lot about the power and the risks of a racist public imagination.
Super, thanks a lot. If I can just jump in real quick before I turn to General Brooks. For those in the audience who perhaps are watching this, from Korea or, don't have much experience with the United States, I think there's perhaps a lack of immediate knowledge of how race isn't just a historical problem in the United States and the South, that it also made a tremendous difference in northern industrial cities. And Angela, I know you've done and are continuing to do some research on issues like mass incarceration and urban issues involving race and policing, and we can come to some of those topics a little bit later. But I was just recently reading some research by John Clegg and Adnan Usmani. I don't know if you're familiar with their work or not, about the economic roots of racism. And they actually make a quite interesting point, which is related to the northern industrial towns and cities, that the transition in the US from an agrarian to an industrialized society happened in 2 phases. And African Americans, were delayed in their movement into the industrial workforce. And by the time they came in there, in fact, that industrial workforce was starting to decline already. And that the white workers who were working in those factories were seeing the arrival of those African Americans at a time when their own industries were starting to decline, as a threat. And that in particular in the North, this is one of the sort of urban explanations for how it is that we end up with racism. So it's interesting that you talked about the experience of your own family arriving in the 1960s in a Detroit that was in some sense already beginning to show some aspects of decline. So I thought that was kind of interesting. General Brooks, if you can jump in here, please.
Well, first, Dr. Richey, thanks for letting me join this distinguished group. And I appreciate the stories that have been told thus far. Each of us comes from a slightly different perspective of the American experience, as we're describing it, and perhaps even the global experience, writ much larger. I come from a long family line that's one of the best documented African-American families in the United States. This is on my maternal side. Our family came to the United States as slaves in the late 1600s. And so my family's been in the United States for a very long time. But very little of that time have we been granted the full rights of citizenship. In some of my branches of family, there were freedmen who lived free for many, many years and for several generations. Some of them had property. along the Potomac River. Some had been slaves at Mount Vernon, even under George Washington and Bushrod Washington, and received manumission from the Washington estate as each of them passed away. And land was granted to them. That land has since just about all been taken, been lost, been occupied under eminent domain. Some parts of the family moved into the Washington, D.C. area where the Washington Navy Yard is right now. And this is the Quander family, again, one of the oldest and best documented. But the reality that that side of the family is documented is unusual. Oddly enough, you would think that a family that has been around the United States since the 1600s, all families would be easily documented, and that's not the case for African-American families. On my Brooks line, I can only trace back to just before the Civil War in rural Loudoun County, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. And my roots are really Virginian in all branches. Both my parents are natives of Alexandria, and their roots are from the western parts of Virginia and the city of Alexandria as well. But that progenitor, Richard Henry Brooks, ended up serving in both the Confederacy and in the Union forces as a body servant to a Confederate officer initially. He defected from the lines and crossed over the Potomac River, followed the C&O Canal, was harassed by Union pickets, Union soldiers who were outposting the city of Washington, D.C., ultimately made it into Union lines after bypassing Union soldiers, after escaping from Confederate soldiers as well, and was immediately taken in to be a body servant for a Union officer who distinguished himself at Gettysburg. That particular officer sent my great-great-great-grandfather to Maine with his wife. He escorted her from Virginia to Maine, and she chose to teach him how to read and write. And so literacy began in our family because someone broke the rules, and because escape made possible an opportunity for freedom that was not granted to him, but that he had to create for himself, and then others assisted him. And that generated a line in the Brooks family of achievers and entrepreneurs. This happened back just after the Civil War and up to the present time. So I have a very interesting history. Another one of my lines is mixed race from pre-Civil War times. And perhaps that is what caused some of the white-driven ideologies of racial purity into these manifestations that we talked about, the Ku Klux Klan, the biases that happened in factories in the North, the perception of they're taking our jobs. And so in the present generation, interestingly enough, it is almost come full circle. While we are not a post-racial society by any means, I've experienced racism at every step of my life. My father is a career Army officer. He experienced racism at every step of his life and career in the military and outside in society, although in varying degrees as time went on, but it was never gone, and it still is not gone, even in my experience, and as we all experience as we look around to see what's happening in the world, even as we speak in this video conference. And so this ever-present sense of racism has been, for my family members, an obstacle to overcome, to not accept that we were inferior. In fact, to have to demonstrate over and over and over again that we were more than fully qualified for anything we would be considered to do. And it's unfortunate, in my view, that it would take so many generations from those 1600s slaves to be able to have a successor that would be a first at anything in the United States. And I've had to be a first, a historic first, time and time and time again. And there are many positions, even in our military, that still have not been occupied by a person of color. And so we have progressed a long way, but we have such a long way still to go. I think about actually just one last thought here, that in many cases, the US tradition of racist behaviors and ideologies was exported into our foreign experiences. I remember serving in Germany in one of my early assignments in the early 1980s during the Cold War. And I was told very early on that certain areas downtown and in different large cities like Frankfurt, where you just can't go. because they're racially separated in there. Well, the U.S. military brought that culture into the club and recreational scene of Europe, of occupied Europe. The same thing happened in Korea, and I witnessed places like that had many fights and riots, as they were referred to then, race riots in the 1970s, and were still largely segregated in usage by the 1990s when I first served in Korea. And so it wasn't that Korea was necessarily biased against African Americans, against others, but it's that Americans brought that and signaled that there ought to be some sort of separation. And that continued for a very, very long time. And so it's been interesting to see how Korea has changed that. There was some worry about what would happen with the first African American commander of United Nations Command and U.S. Forces Korea and the Combined Forces Command. And I felt much more welcomed than I felt even in the 1990s, and then tried to demonstrate that I cared about their cultures much as I hoped they would care about mine and all of my cultures, including the African American part of my culture. And simple things like learning the Korean national anthem signified that, hey, I'm with you. And while we may be different in our origin, we're united in one purpose. And I think that's maybe the big message that we can carry to one another as we are having this conversation. So thanks for letting me join you.
Super, thank you very much. That's a moving story. I think it's very nice to have seen you talk about your historic family roots, and then take us all the way up to your presence here on the peninsula over the last few decades. I think that's a quite comprehensive and fascinating set of stories. Nemo, please, your contribution.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Richey, for letting me join this very distinguished company. I feel very honored. Yeah, well, I didn't actually plan to go that far back in terms of my family history, but seeing as other participants went back quite a long way back, I thought maybe I should tell you a little bit about my family. My paternal grandfather told me several times, and this is totally undocumented, that his family, my paternal part of the family, came from China, and they decided to settle in Korea back in the 18th century. And I found that quite surprising, the fact that as a Korean man, quite a conservative one as well, that he would mention it several times, the fact that our family has a relatively short history, and the fact that we originated as from this guy who looked after horses for a very minor Chinese nobility. So basically, I think he may have been a slave and was set free. We have no documentation about this. But anyway, so I was very aware from quite an early age that we are not really Korean, maybe compared to my classmates. And with that, I never told anybody. I never told any of my Korean friends in case I would be considered not Korean. I think maybe Professor Richey is aware that in Korea, in history books, the word that this country is a homogeneous race, only has one single race, that only disappeared, that phrase only disappeared from Korean history books towards the mid-1990s. So up until then, all Koreans were told that we belonged to one single race. And this knowledge that my grandfather gave me, like totally undocumented knowledge, it made me feel really uncomfortable as a child growing up in Korea in the 70s. And after that, my parents' job took us to Bahrain, where I first experienced as an 8-year-old, everybody looking at my family wherever we went. And I thought maybe it was because I wasn't wearing the hijab as a proper Arabic woman should be doing. And I remember asking my parents to get me that, which I never got. So when Professor Naimou told me about how she experienced as an 8-year-old when she was experimenting with art, she also experienced her first sense of racism towards her. Yeah, that was a total echo for me. Also, after that, my family went to the UK, to London, when I was 12, and living in the immigrant community in London, which was quite small at the time, that gave me yet another perspective. And it was an interesting time living in the UK in the 80s. I probably would say that I was quite sheltered from racist views, as I was at a fairly conservative girls' convent school in London. But when I started work in my 20s, I started to experience racism, as in when I first started work as a news producer. Some people would ask can they talk to the person above me, not me, but like, you know, who's your boss? Can I talk? I don't want to talk to you. Where's your boss? I got that quite a lot. And it was difficult to place whether it was because I was a woman or whether I looked young. You know, it's something that I think I tried not to think about too much at the time. But what happened after that, I came back to Korea in my 30s, and I realized that this country is becoming very multiracial, but somehow authorities are unable to reflect that reality in their various policies, in the education system, in all aspects of society, basically. Just to give you one example, my daughter, when she started school, the teacher designated who sits next to who, and nobody wanted to sit next to a boy whose mother was from the Philippines. And there was nothing done about that situation. Like, everybody refused, so he sat by himself in class. And when I found that out, I asked the teacher if, this is not right. And if possible, can my daughter sit with him? So that's what ended up happening. But this is not so long ago. It's only, it's like 3 years ago, in the middle of Gangnam. Wow. In South Korea. So I realized that, when General Brooks said a lot of these attitudes were kind of exported by the US, I wouldn't necessarily agree that all those attitudes were, all the negative things were brought by the US. But I think some of the negativity definitely were exported back and forth between different powerful countries. I would have to agree. And I think in a way, South Korea is definitely doing something to people from weaker economies, so to speak. And that is something I think is something that needs to be corrected ASAP here in South Korea.
Super, thanks. I'll just, since the first thing I think you bring up an interesting point towards the end of your comments, when you're talking about your experience as a news producer, obviously, racism feeds into a whole set of other, discriminatory practices, including, gender discrimination as well. And so, these forms of social exclusion end up intertwining and teasing out where the causes and effects are, sociologically can be quite hard. But of course, as a lived experience, all of those factors, come together in some way. Second thing is, if I could just jump in, to say something about, current policy in South Korea, which you discussed at the end of your comments there. Just two very two very small things in some ways, but I think they're quite indicative. The response to the coronavirus by the Korean government has generally been praised around the world for the testing and the contact tracing and the remedies. And on that technocratic side of things, I would argue things have generally indeed merited the positive response. But like many other countries, South Korea also instituted a series of economic measures, including relief payments and some other forms of stimulus. And I note, by the way, that non-Koreans are not eligible for those payments. It doesn't matter if you're a documented legal resident. It doesn't matter if you pay taxes. If you're not a Korean citizen or an ethnic Korean, you don't have the right to those payments. And there doesn't seem to be any rationale for that other than the fact that those payments are for Koreans and not for others. I have students who are from overseas, and they're working part-time jobs, and they sit next to their Korean classmates who are also working part-time jobs, and only the Koreans are getting these stimulus payments for their or the unemployment insurance payments for their part-time jobs. There was also a recent policy that was instituted that when foreign nationals go abroad, before they return to Korea, they have to go to a medical facility within 48 hours of returning to Korea and have a checkup by a doctor at a registered, whatever that means, medical facility in order to come back to Korea and keep their long-term visa status. And Korean citizens don't have to do that, and ethnic Koreans don't have to do that, even if they're not citizens. So, I've noticed that Korea has made a tremendous leap in progress on race-based issues, even in the 10 years that I've been here. Tremendous difference, but miles to go, I think, before we solve this problem here in Korea, much as in the United States and in other places. So if I can turn now to, I guess, the proximate cause of this roundtable, it really sort of came out of the protests that were a reaction to, and in some cases, an opportunistic hijacking of the unfortunate killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by a Minneapolis police officer. And, I guess, what came out of that was a series of protests and a sort of, sudden reemergence in terms of intensity and of, front of mind attention, both in the U.S. and abroad, to not only the event itself, namely his killing, but also the protests that came afterwards. What, if anything, in your estimation, is different this time? This isn't the first time that we've had protests about racial issues. This isn't the first time that an African-American man has been killed in a seemingly wanton and unjustified way by a police officer. What seems like maybe it's different this time? And I can start perhaps again with Mr. Moss.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is nothing new. There are roughly 1,000 police-involved killings every year. And going back to 2005, only 5 police officers have been successfully prosecuted of those roughly 15,000 police-involved killings. What is different is, I think we have Steve Jobs to thank to a certain extent. Everyone has a video camera on their phone. So what we have is we've seen some technological developments such that in Mississippi, when I was a boy, I heard the expression, well, so-and-so has just come up missing. The civil rights workers who were in Mississippi organizing African Americans to register to vote, some of them came up missing. With everyone having a smartphone, that kind of violence is now made public. And I think what we've seen is a crescendo of this sort of brutality that we can't turn away from. We can't call it an exception. We can't say, well, this was just a bad cop. I think what has changed is Americans seem to be realizing that actually, no, these are structural patterns. We have law, in the legal profession, there's this saying that the standard of review becomes the standard of care. So if you're a police officer, what do you think about if you're having a bad day and you're brutalizing someone? What is the standard of review that you will face? In the military, there's the UCMJ, which is very strict. You will face a court-martial, and military soldiers understand the difference of their behavior in wartime and not in civilian situations, and they know the rules that are applied. Our police officers are treated as civilians. They cannot be sued personally because of qualified immunity rules as interpreted by the Supreme Court, which state that it is practically impossible to sue a police officer. The worst thing that could happen is that it is recorded and gets publicity, and then there's public protest, at which point they may lose their job. But they'll never face personal liability civilly in terms of being sued individually. And the chances of them ever being prosecuted criminally are extremely remote. And I think it's important to say that, as a diplomat serving overseas, I always make the point that we aspire to the values of our foundational documents. Our Constitution, based in the 18th century Enlightenment philosophers, all men, all people are created equal and are endowed with similar rights. That's an aspirational statement. How that is translated into practice has varied dramatically in our history and is one of both, it's a tragic story, but it's a story that I like to think of as having a comic or positive narrative arc, that we aspire to give meaning to those words. The challenge is, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but allowed for penal servitude for criminals. There were exceptions. How did that get translated into reality? The 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all of these very important foundational documents that prescribe equality, equal treatment under the law, those get translated always into a local context. We're educated locally, we receive health care locally, we encounter the police locally, and a court system that is local. We vote locally. And I think it would be very difficult to say that all Americans have equal access to the ballot currently, have equal access to fair treatment in a criminal context or in their interactions with the police, have equal access to quality education, or have equal access to quality health care. So it's part of the, if you will, our history, our dramatic narrative of how do we as individuals and as individual communities try to give meaning to these aspirational documents. And I think now we've seen a bit of a turning point where more Americans are having to say, oh, you're right, I do have advantages. I was arrested once in New Orleans. New Orleans is famous for having a pretty brutal police force. It's been under a consent decree for some time and is improving, thankfully. I was arrested as a college kid for no reason, thrown in jail. And, I called a friend's father who was a judge. One of my black classmates at Loyola University probably would not have been able to do that. And their family would have had to come up with money to bail them out. So it's again, I go back to the personal because I think it's important for all of us to think about our own situation and how the structures that exist locally have benefited some, and to imagine what it would be like had we not, as a white American, had I not had those advantages, and to try to understand what someone else's lived experience would be. I think as a country, we're beginning to do that, which is a great thing.
Great, thank you. Angela, what feels different, if anything, this time?
Thanks. Well, I think maybe just a few things to highlight, and one of them is that it might be the stunning failure of this state. This state is now notable, this country, the United States, for its response to the, to the pandemic, and the way that it has deepened so many of the existing inequities that have already been described. And so you have so many people, mass unemployment, huge economic strain. But also you have, in Minneapolis, the long, slow work of activists that have been organizing for decades. And that might be one difference, along with the videotape, the recording. Because there have been many local activist organizations for prisoners' rights, for an end to prison and policing as we know it in the United States. And, these are activists that include the mothers of prisoners, but the prisoners themselves who have been organizing while incarcerated, and survivors of police brutality. And so they've been advocating for practical solutions that would have seemed inconceivable, unimaginable to be discussed, in mainstream liberal discourse. And, those were practical solutions, a way of challenging, for example, the funding for education and infrastructure and health, community development, the way that that funding has been kept scarce by design in low-income neighborhoods, while law enforcement budgets, stay strong regardless of crime levels, and police get tasked with broader and broader roles that they're not, maybe it's impossible to properly train for, or to do well given the core job of police. At the same time that they've been working for these practical changes for a very long time, they've also been very conceptually and imaginatively daring, thinking about untangling the knots of race and capitalism, to look honestly at those threads and say, how can we understand the shape of the problem? Superficial solutions are going to be limited unless we can look honestly at the problem. And I don't think that's happened in any kind of sustained way in this country. Many people have said there's never been a true reckoning, a true coming together, a true honest recognition and discussion about what the shape of the problem is. And so the idea that police and prison is the solution proposed over and over again to what gets seen as disorder just has been shown to fail over and over again. And so I think there are new conversations about how we can envision safety and community, what life in its fullness could be for everyone.
That's great. I think one of the things that's come out of this conversation is that I would consider perhaps not new, but that's gained new prominence, and that I think hasn't been discussed as much recently, is how we can re-envision policing as really to protect and serve as it's supposed to be, rather than a sort of adversarial attitude between the police and the communities. And I wish we had some more time to talk about this in greater detail, particularly with respect to how it is that the police frequently are trained in SWAT tactics and are, and that sort of dominates the way that they're taught to think, and the military equipment that is given to them through various federal programs from the military. That might be something we can come back to. If I can turn this question perhaps in a slightly different way and get to some of the as you said, the fundamental questions, and sort of redirect a version of this question to General Brooks. You wrote in a piece in the Military Times in the context of racism in the U.S. after the Floyd death, and how this context of racism has an institutional structure and an institutional layer. And in that piece, you spoke of a breach of what you called a sacred trust. Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that, General Brooks, either in general or with respect to the military?
Well, sure. I'll go into a little bit, and then I want to take a bit of a journey back to the question we were just addressing. Also, if I can do that on what was different about the current situation. But let me say this: that article was an open letter that I published first at the Belfer Center, and then it moved to some other places, as happens, and I'm fine with that. There were 2 points that I was trying to make. The first is that I've seen this type of racism happen before, sadly. I'm disappointed that I'm seeing it again. And that includes everything from the use of forces on the street and the violent protestations and perhaps over-responses by law enforcement who are under great pressure. But the breach of trust that I was talking about, the breach of sacred trust, was not about that. It was about the relationship between the military and the citizenry, that the military, with its vast power, will never abuse its citizens. And the corollary to that is that the civilian sovereign will never put the military in a position where it will abuse its citizenry. And what I saw happen was a breach of that trust. So I wasn't talking about racism with the breach of sacred trust. I'm talking about the practice of balancing power in our citizenry and what it means to democracy, and that had been put at risk. So having said that, let me come back to the racial aspects of this. You know, as a child of the late 1950s, I witnessed the upheavals of the latter part of the battle that ended in the Civil Rights Act. Didn't end racism, didn't end some of our racist practices and ideologies, but it moved us a long way from it. It became in many ways the fulfillment of 100 years from the 13th Amendment until the actual manifestations occurred. 100 years. And the battle had been going on for a long time. I think about the Niagara movement being organized in 1905, when it was clear that there was a retrenchment, moving backwards to conditions that were even worse than slavery, where freedom was being deprived in a very different way, and the laws were being created to reinforce it. And so what was different this time, in my view, is that the laws were now fair, and what we saw was practices outside of the law. Back then, and let's say from the beginning of Jim Crow all the way up through the late 1960s and early 1970s, in those days where, as Angela said, when Detroit was on fire, and as I recall, driving through the smoke of Washington, D.C. a year later in 1968, the laws were unfair at that point in time, and the practice was even more unfair outside of the law. So what's different now is that the rule of law has advanced, but the practice isn't. And so the accountability that Mitchell talked about that has been lacking on how we create accountability for law enforcement that violates their authority to use power against their fellow citizens. And they have that authority, and they need to have that authority. But when that authority is abused, what is the method of accountability? And as it regards the use of power against minorities, particularly ethnic minorities, people of color, like myself and like my relatives, there is very little expectation of justice that someone who has this perpetrated against them would feel. There's not going to be accountability. And I'm thankful that there were TV cameras at Selma, where buses on the road outside of Birmingham could be filmed on fire, where the accountability for people who, as Mitchell said, came up missing, and we use the same expression in the Black community, that came up missing. There was accountability that began to emerge by a citizenry that was outraged, regardless of race. And what we have again is the same sort of thing, where imaging has made it possible to prove the point that has been said by people of color for so long. It's not gone, it's still here, it's unfair, and I have no recourse. And I expect more from my country, I expect more from the laws that have changed to protect me and give me those same rights that the enlightened ones put onto paper. And so this is what has been different in the present time, but all too similar in many ways about this unfulfilled expectation. Last point I would make here is, again, as I think about my decades abroad as a military officer, and trying to help countries build good governance. We weren't just defeating enemies. We were actually trying to create conditions for good governance to emerge, for civil society to take root again, and for preventing those who would seek to keep it in chaos from succeeding. And I think about the concept of seeing extrajudicial killings being done by police officers in places like Baghdad, Iraq, during the surge while I was there. Horrendous, grievous behaviors. But if they had influence over the judges, as had been carried over from Saddam's era of terror, then it was not any different for those who were being terrorized. It didn't feel any different, no matter what the Americans had done. And so it was so important to try to help create a condition where the judiciary could have enough protection that they could make a relatively independent, a gutsy call on holding national police and local police accountable, and military when they engage in these sorts of things. This is what now has to happen, even in my country, where we've got to create a system of accountability that's appropriate and fair under the current rule of law. We don't need new law. What we need is fair application of it and an expectation of prosecution for not only committers of crimes, but also for perpetrators of abuse of power. An expectation of prosecution. And I think that would move us a lot further than where we are right now. It's a wake-up call.
Great, super, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to kind of go ahead and skip on to the next question. I do just want to remind each of you that, you know, if you want to jump in and ping pong off of each other's comments, you're welcome to do so. It doesn't just have to be me, you know, answering the questions, or asking the questions.
If I could jump in just briefly.
Well, there we go.
I just wanted to build on what General Brooks was saying. And, you know, the expectation of prosecution depends on community standards. If the first line of protection for an abusive police officer is that his fellow officers will lie, and many police union contracts prevent police being interviewed for 48 hours until after an incident so they can get their story straight. So there's that level of protection. Then there's prosecutors depend on their success with having a positive relationship with the local police force. What is that relationship going to be like if you have prosecutors actually doing their jobs and prosecuting police for this kind of abuse? Then the next level is the jury. I lived most of my life in Louisiana. Up until very recently, 10 members of a jury could convict someone of murder, capital crime, either death or life in prison, and that was adequate. What will the local jury do with this kind of case? And in Louisiana, what that meant was 10 white members of a jury, the 2 obligatory black members of the jury would find someone innocent or disagree sometimes, but that person would still be sent to Angola for life or to, get the death penalty. So it's important to understand that there are great strengths to our federal system, and perhaps one of its weaknesses is any change that is legislated from Washington has to be implemented by each state, by each local community, and this is going to be a very big lift.
And can I just jump in very quickly?
Yeah, please do.
I was also, with regard to the Korean media's reporting of the situation going on in the US, back when the LA riots happened in the early 1990s, Korean media was mostly reporting about the sufferings of the Korean American businesses, how they were looted, how all these Korean American families are destroyed. But this time round, I felt that things had improved somewhat, in that they weren't focusing too much on the different races within the US, which group is attacking which group and so on. But it seemed that a lot of the Korean media reporting was focused on the suffering of various people, like in that people matter. not the Korean community. How much suffering has the Korean community gone under? Do you know what I mean? So, in a way, I was heartened to see that happening.
Super. Angela, it seemed like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, if it's okay, just to respond to a few of them, and maybe one beginning with the store, the convenience store where the teenage worker, called the police. Mustafa Bayoumi wrote about this, but it speaks to the laws that are in place that make all of this more possible, unfortunately. And there are these criminal abatement laws. It's a form of community policing enshrined in this law that has store owners fearing any crime committed on their property, because eventually that could lead them to lose the business. So you have, an Arabic-owned store, but somebody who had good ties with the black who had to come out and try to explain himself, and already had those relationships. So there's something just to speak to that. And then the way that the legal affirmation of qualified immunity also comes with many legal decisions related to law enforcement and prisons that defer to the warden, for example, as to who could be put in solitary confinement, under what conditions, that there's actually no standard. You can just say administrative confinement. There are so many ways that we have built up a body of legal decisions that get pulled forward in time through the use of precedents, and get interpreted in sometimes contesting ways or competing ways. The other thing is just to mention that there's an interesting book by a scholar, Stuart Schrader, and it just came out earlier in end of 2019, called Badges Without Borders. And in it, he tracks the institutional and specific players within the various law enforcement agencies, the CIA, the FBI, during the Cold War, when the idea of modern policing could be exported and trained and could be used to train police in more than 57 countries. It was something like almost 80 countries around the world. Iraq was one of them. So there were, Iraqi officials who had come in 1961 to the US to gain training. They returned. How they administered, what their practice was, we don't know too much about, but they gained promotion. They were promoted after 63 with the Ba'athist, beginning of Ba'athist rule. They used prisons in Iraq that were built in the 50s by British contractors. And it reminds us that this is never a national question, but that even policing in the US has very specific links. They're not just analogies. Very specific links with the way we now do counterinsurgency, which I can't speak to, except that the attempts to trace those connections, how they work and how they're part of an imperial history, is something that can help us also get out of sometimes the idea that we have a wholly national and only, simply national system, which of course we don't.
Super. Well, in that sense, I'll have to begin to shut things down here within the next 5 to 10 minutes. We're already pushing up on our time limit as it is. So let's have, I think, 2 last questions. One of which I think has in some ways been opened up by each of you in your discussions over the last couple of minutes. And so I'm going to ask this question sort of in a broad fashion, and you can each answer this however you want. And I'm doing this in part because of the role of the Asia Society here in Korea. It's sort of naturally, I think I want to turn to looking at the international dimension of what's going on in the U.S. With regard to race currently. And I'll just ask the question sort of very, very broadly, and that is, does the racism issue in the United States hurt the status of the United States abroad? If so, how? And particularly for those, Mr. Moss and General Brooks, a sort of practical question. How does that make it more difficult, if at all, for the U.S. to accomplish its foreign policy objectives?
I guess I could start as the person on the U.S. government payroll who's responsible for communicating with the Korean public. I would say it depends entirely on how we approach this. If we attempt to deny the facts, if we attempt to obfuscate the reality of our current historical moment or the reality of our past, if we're naive in the way that we present our past, then people will mistrust us. Our partners are very smart. People are smart. They can tell when a government spokesperson or a government representative is trying to hide something. I think the best thing that we can do is the same thing that we did during the Cold War. We didn't win the Cold War by saying, oh, the Russians are terrible. We won the Cold War by having integrity, by being honest about our challenges, by tolerating dissent, by inviting speakers who disagreed with US policy to come out to foreign countries and engage with audiences, and people could say, okay, the Americans aren't perfect, but they seem to at least acknowledge that, and they believe in their perfectibility. They believe in the attempt to ensure the promises of our Constitution and our constitutional amendments and our laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. I have to believe, as a representative of the American people overseas, that we are trying. At the same time, I have to be very honest with audiences about the challenges that we face. And as long as we do that, I think we can maintain credibility. Some of our competitors in the region discredit themselves by pretending, there's no problem here. And just to conclude, we as government officials take an oath to the Constitution. Part of the Constitution is freedom of speech. And our journalist brethren have a constitutional role that is just as important as ours, and that is ensuring that the American people have the truth. So it's part of my responsibility as a public affairs officer to support my journalist colleagues in their work in making sure that both the American people and our international audiences have the truth and have a proper understanding of what's going on in our own country. Thanks.
Excellent. Nemo, if you could jump in, you spend a lot of time overseas. How do you think that racism in the U.S. affects the U.S. Abroad, or the perceptions of the U.S. abroad?
I want to answer that question in a more hopeful way. Taking South Korea as an example, this country is the genuine ethnic Korean, like it or not. This society is becoming more and more multiracial, multicultural by day. As Professor Richey explained earlier, even the policy of giving out relief payments, even that is dividing people, legitimate foreigners living here and paying tax money and they're not able to get the benefits, and the amount's not that big, the relief payment amount. Anyway, so instead of having everybody turn Korean in the name of South Korea becoming multicultural, I'm hoping that South Korean authorities will somehow learn from what the US is going through at the moment, and then see that this is a problem that every society in the world has. And I'm hoping that my country will somehow take a lesson from this, because we do not have a very happy history in terms of citizens' belief in the system being violated. I mean, just take the Gwangju massacre as an example, where hundreds of people were killed by military forces, our own military forces. So I'm hoping that people here will not just think of it as something that's going on abroad in the US, but I'm hoping that through responsible reporting, I'm hoping that authorities here, as well as the people in general, the general public, will learn from what is going on over in the US.
Thank you so much. General Brooks.
Well, I would have to say that I do believe that we weaken some of our credibility abroad in the very important messages that are communicated by Americans abroad, American businesses, American government, on what our values really are. And I believe they are American values. So I'm not suggesting that this is a false ideology that we're trying to convey to others. But sometimes we come down pretty hard on other countries as they deprive rights from ethnic or religious minorities, or if they suspend government and go in a certain direction. I would hope that we would not recognize this as something that is only American. This is affecting everyone as they witness even America having similar problems. And while our credibility can be lessened in some of the things that we say, hey, we're not going to work with you, we're not going to provide these foreign military sales unless you do the following things regarding human rights or rights of women, rights of minorities in your culture. We maybe have to recognize that we've got some work to do ourselves. And I think it can be encouraging for other countries who struggle with similar issues, whether more acute or not, they struggle with similar issues, to see how the United States works through this. How do we take steps to become a more perfect union? How do we take the steps to demonstrate that our values are important enough to us that when we make a mistake, when we fall off the line of it, that we're fighting to get back to what our values really are? That can be encouraging to the rest of the world. And we have the power to do that. And the world is watching the United States right now, as it will continue to do.
Super. I'll just point out, as someone working on research in international relations and in international security, we tend to talk a lot about power as one of the components of how states advance their interests. And power has several different metrics that can include things that are relatively obvious, like military power or economic size. But one of the underappreciated variables is how successful a society is at mobilizing its resources, whether those be economic or whether those be social, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, one of the important sub-variables of that variable is how united your society is. If your society has relatively significant levels of social trust, relatively significant levels of buy-in into the government, it becomes much easier for the administrative and bureaucratic aspects of the state to mobilize those resources and apply them abroad. And it comes down to something that's essentially a cliche, but united we stand, divided we fall. And I think regardless of what the perception of the U.S. is from abroad, I think there's something about the fundamental core nature of a society and a state that's based around how cohesive that is. And it's, I think, unfortunate, at least looking at the U.S. from a distance, being here in Korea, to see how polarized and how divided we've become. And it's not only racial; it involves a lot of other elements as well. But I think certainly race is a significant part of it. So we're bumping up against our time limit here. So I'm going to just ask one final question and let each of you, weigh in on that however you would like. And then we'll let everybody go. So I guess my question is, from each of your respective professional roles either currently or in your case, General Brooks, being retired from the military. How would you describe the imagination of race within your professional world? Is it something that people think about a lot? How do they think about it? And what perhaps does that tell us, not only about the current situation with race relations in the U.S., but also what types of prospects we might have for things getting hopefully better or perhaps worse? And I guess I'll start again with Mr. Moss.
Well, I can say, as a Foreign Service officer in the State Department, we are trying, but we have a long ways to go. And the good news of that is I think there is a real awareness that we need to both increase recruitment and retention so that we have a foreign service that looks like America. In my own experience, I've seen many of the success stories of that effort, but the numbers are not where they need to be. And the Secretary has acknowledged that. And, we are making, I think, a concerted effort to educate ourselves. That's why I started with the statement that I did, that we each have a responsibility to try to understand this problem. And it begins with understanding our own implicit biases. And we have a 4-hour training course that we are required to take on implicit bias and how it functions in our workplace and the way we treat colleagues, the way we promote or not promote peers. Do we listen to the quieter voices in the room? Do we make an effort to actively give opportunities to someone who may not have the intrinsic social advantages to know to place themselves so that they know those opportunities exist? So I would say, at least as far as the Department of State is concerned, we recognize the problem and we are making attempts both institutionally, but I would say also individually to address it. I'm very proud to work for Ambassador Harry Harris. We as an embassy community organized a solidarity walk and a moment of silence, a candlelight vigil, as General Abrams did in, I think, both in Osan and Humphreys. There were similar events. So I think the political is personal. We all have work to do to understand this very complex historical problem that has created our current reality. And as part of that, in our institutions, we also have work to do. And I'm very proud to be part of an institution, the U.S. Embassy here in Seoul, but also the Department of State, that is moving in the right direction, is trying to implement policies based on this understanding so that we can actually embody the values that our foundational documents represent. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much. Angela.
Maybe I can speak to the kind of, there are long disciplinary problems with the development of literature as an object of study. But if we look to the body of work, writing fiction, poetry, and drama in the US context, it's existed for centuries by racialized writers, non-white writers. And it's just that work hadn't been canonized or affirmed as national, as American. Instead, it was whiteness and the promise of whiteness that was seen to be an artistic and national project. But there were radical pamphlets that circulated when it was illegal for enslaved persons to read or write, that circulated with merchant seamen who had to be chained to ships in the Charleston, South Carolina port so as not to bring incendiary material, into land. And you have even someone like Thomas Jefferson taking a digression in Notes on the State of Virginia to say that Phillis Wheatley wasn't and couldn't have been the poet of the author of these poems. It meant that literature and the literary imagination must have meant something, and it definitely still does. Toni Morrison has talked about racism as a distraction. You can spend hundreds of years trying to prove racist ideas false or respond and insist on your humanity to people who wouldn't see it. And she said that as a way to say that there's a world to invent where you are the subjects of the makers and that you can see otherwise, freed from the duty to be ethnographic or transparent or constrained. You know, those who would you into an object or a problem or a category of suspicion. And so I think those are some of the energies that go within literature and beyond that for me is heartening and exciting and hopeful.
Awesome. Can I take your class sometime?
Yeah, you too.
Me too.
Sounds amazing. General Brooks.
Well, this really is the heart of all of the dialogue that's happening nationally and internationally right now. It's the different imaginings, different imaginations of what race looks like in our society at a given point in time. And I think the truth is, it depends on who you are. It depends on where you sit and what you've experienced in the same reality. You can stand side by side and experience two different things. And the importance of the moment is to get that out and to have it acknowledged that it's different for me. Because I'm a 6'4" black man, I will be told that I'm intimidating and that when I talk to somebody, I should stay seated. When someone who's 6'4" and not black will not be told that. And we're in the same experience, in the same organization, sitting side by side. I want it to be the way that I think my nieces and nephews see it. I have 8 nieces and nephews, and many of them are biracial or are in biracial relationships, and they refuse to be categorized as anything except for an American. And I want it to be that way. But 2 of them are African-American males who are not mixed race. And their right to bear arms is not the same as my white nephew's right to bear arms. It's not the same. If they have a weapon inside of their vehicle in an open carry state like Texas, they're likely to be intimidated, incarcerated, or shot. Especially if a policeman asks the questions, do you have any weapons in your car, knives or guns? And if the answer is yes, because it's an open carry state, they're in a different situation than my white nephews. And so I want it to be the way they want the world to be. And we're not there yet. People of my generation and the generation that still precedes me have the obligation to make it so. And we've got to be open enough to the conversation to hear one another that we're experiencing something different at the same time.
Super, thank you very much. Just one last thing, and then I'll let Nemo have the final word. I think it's interesting that you bring up, the right to bear arms being different, and how, we can imagine the different situation with respect to being in an open carry state. As I said, the proximate cause of the conversation that we're having today was the death of George Floyd. But if we go back several months earlier, there was the death of Philando Castile, which was also in Minneapolis, who was actually carrying a weapon legally in his car and was doing exactly what the officer told him to do when the officer shot him. And he was trying to get his weapon to show that to the officer, which was the officer's precise instruction. And I think that when we're talking about the U.S. Racial imagination, I think one of the interesting things that has changed a little bit is how Second Amendment defendants, particularly conservative ones in the U.S., have begun to reimagine policing precisely because of the issue that you just brought up. Some of them are beginning to think, well, what's happening now with the differential rights to carry weapons under the Second Amendment might have some backfire effect on the larger U.S. support for the Second Amendment. And when you look at the conservative media, I think there's been an increase in interest in race, in part because of its connection with the Second Amendment in a sort of indirect way. So I think that's a very interesting set of points you make, General Brooks. Thank you. Nemo Kim, you get the last word.
Oh, thank you. I love how Professor Richey phrased the question to all of us. the word imagination, I think, is key in that it means that it's whatever people imagine race to be. Mr. Moss referred to the Ambassador Harry Harris, and I know that he has been subject of really terrible reporting by some South Korean media regarding the fact that he has Japanese heritage. And you know, it's whatever you imagine something to be. And also referring back to what Mr. Moss said earlier, the political is personal. A lot of the times when I do reporting here in South Korea, I get asked by my fellow South Koreans, oh, okay, so you must be the interpreter. So where's the journalist? Because you look Korean and you're obviously not a journalist with The Guardian or with the Billboard or whatever. So, you know, it's the fact that it is imagined is, I think, something that makes racism, aspects of race, really, really dangerous.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of your incredible insights, your expertise. This has been really enlightening for me, and it's been an honor not only to get your input on, you know, some of the, let's say, more abstract questions that I've asked, but also the way in which you've all talked so openly about certain aspects of your personal lives and the history of your families. I think that's really significant, and I'm extremely grateful. So with that being said, on behalf of the Asia Society of Korea, I would like to thank our four guests today, Minister Counselor Mitchell Moss from the U.S. Embassy in Korea, Professor Angela Naimou from Clemson University, General Vincent Brooks, retired now at the University of Texas and Harvard University's Belfer Center, and Nemo Kim from The Guardian and other publications as well here in Korea. So thank each of you. I thank each of you for taking the time, and I thank the audience for taking the time to listen to the discussion today and watch this video. We hope that you will join us again for another edition. Thanks very much.